Welcome, everyone. This is FileMaker Development in Large Enterprise. I'm Beatrice Beaubien, formerly assistant professor at the University of Ottawa and subsequently head of a biotech research group. I've been a trained project manager since 1993, and I'm an FBA member and a FileMaker certified developer. Since 1997, I've been principal at i2i, a FileMaker development company in Toronto. And since 2006, I've been FileMaker project manager at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, 7 servers, about 700 users, and about 130 databases. A couple of things I like to do, very briefly. I like growing herbs and topiary and ferns, and I cook things like I bake my own sour bread, and I cook cuisines from around the world. How many people here support FileMaker in large enterprises in-house? Excellent. How many support FileMaker as an outside consultant for large enterprise? Lovely. How many people do not work with large enterprise? All right. I'm going to be preaching to the converted here, but the benefits that enterprise FileMaker developer brings, that's one of the things that we're going to touch on. We're also going to review the skills of yours that in many cases are being strengthened at the moment, and what the challenges and opportunities are that present themselves. We're going to talk about the power of data silos. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that. And we're going to talk about reconciling formal change management and agile methodologies. And finally, we're going to conclude with some ideas about engaging with confidence in enterprise. I'm going to define my terms here, FileMaker and Enterprise, and the difference between enterprise applications and applications in enterprise. So, enterprise applications, organization-wide, high user counts. Applications in enterprise can also describe solutions for small work groups, and both are expected to have high availability, and in addition, both types have to conform to enterprise-mandated policies and procedures. It's the work group-focused solutions I'll be emphasizing. And throughout the session, I'm going to be talking about leading projects and taking responsibility for stakeholder interactions, whether you're in-house or an outside consultant. The reason for this is from having experience in both roles, inside and out. It's when the developer takes overall responsibility for the development projects that they can control outcomes. In my experience, it can take diplomacy to assume that role. But if someone else controls the process, someone else controls the processes and the expectations and the communication, the project can resist your best efforts to fulfill the project's objectives on time and on budget. However, you'll always have to work with what you have. If you're an outside consultant, an organization's resistance to giving control to an external project manager may justifiably be based on their not optimal prior experience with that situation. As I said, I've been working for sick kids for 12 years. What FileMaker developers offer to enterprise is quite distinct from what it offers to the enterprise users. And I'm also going to touch on how I see it, the benefits that this type of development offers to the developer. So the benefits to enterprise users, rapidly develop solutions for their work groups, securely bringing the range of the FileMaker platform to users. FileMaker developers always virtually provide an application with a better user experience than the enterprise solutions. And a liaison with a developer such as you, who's experienced in delivering tailored solutions that fulfill workflow needs, is a huge bonus for the enterprise users. Obviously, and we know that there is a place for rapid development of workgroup solutions in enterprise, because these groups' needs tend to be overlooked by the large information systems. The return on investment for FileMaker development in large enterprise is really, really large. So the benefits to enterprise is quite distinct. Instead of getting documents floating around the Excel spreadsheets and, God forbid, the Access databases, they now have a centralized, secure, backed up, shareable data entry and reporting FileMaker tools. And the work groups, as a benefit to enterprise, have access through integration to the data silos. Transparency and documentation of the data collection and databases is a big bonus for IT. No longer do they have to cope with the concept of folders of Excel documents on shared drives. So the benefits to you, I found working with mission-critical work groups gives a valuable perspective on our practice as developers. And applying skills to integrate with data silos is an opportunity to extend and reinforce the developer's integration talents. Enhancing your user experience and user testing skills is one of the bonuses. Before we go into our deep dive, I'm going to contextualize my terms of reference. Small versus large. So in small development, we have ad hoc change is permissible, informal communications, little requirement for a formal project plan, and little or no discussion of risk management. And agile processes simply work. In large, change is a formal process. The documentation of all communication is required. Resources, milestones, and user testing all need to be approved in advance, and risk management is essential. Agile needs to comply with the processes. Adjustment of the developer to the differences in approach is the key to successful projects. You may, as independent developers, you may institute these practices in your non-enterprise development already, and in this case, you'll understand the benefits of this formality. We're going to slice it a little bit differently. Solutions in enterprise, the difference between FileMaker and large enterprise systems, and there's such a dramatic difference. So FileMaker, we know, development time is relatively short. Cost is relatively modest. I'm using the word relatively, and I'll return to that. The security can be granular while leveraging enterprise roles, and ad hoc responses to changes can be accommodated. Large enterprise systems take sometimes years simply in the planning to the RFP, never mind the beginning of the implementation, and never mind the go-live of the implementation. And costs can run into hundreds of thousands or millions. And security is determined in large enterprise systems at an organizational and role-based level. Each change requires organizational approval. Modifications, when they involve large enterprise systems, they tend to have long lead times. So the small versus large tend to fall away when FileMaker developers begin contributing to the data management in enterprise. One proviso is that the attention to change management protocols that the enterprise demands adds a layer of accountability and the developer's resources, time resources, and I'm going to expand on these. So I'm going to begin with project management in enterprise. The broad skills for enterprise: writing detailed project plans, building effective teams, and being a leader, promoting opportunities for data integration. Data integration is so powerful, it's easy to become a champion of it. It'll build you advocates within the organization and take time to get to know the members of the systems teams and the DBAs you have to work with. Full responsibility for communication, recording meetings, keeping lines of communication open, and be proactive when things go sideways. So what follows is a deep dive into the 4 pillars of enterprise development: leading projects, risk management, change management, and security and privacy. And these four elements play a crucial role in FileMaker development in enterprise. This is the process that's codified in my organization. No work begins until this process is completed. The first 2 points are technology agnostic. So the summary and the justification describe the problem space, and it describes why this work is absolutely required. Subsequently, it's a technology-specific view of the objectives and how the objectives will be accomplished with the milestones. And then after that, there is a close analysis of what resources are going to be available for each of these objectives, and then the organization's resources that will be required for deployment. After all of these things are defined, then the risk management analysis is written down with the risks, identified and assessed, and more importantly, how each individual risk is going to be mitigated. When this document is complete, then high-level management must approve and sign off, and only at that point can work begin. Risk. I don't think we talk enough about risk in the FileMaker community. Not accepting that a project may face challenges, some of them possibly serious, compromises the entire outcome. Not being comfortable with risk indicates an unfamiliarity with strategies to deal with it. Risk assessment in a project particularly comes into play in any project that involves integration, whether it be ODBC or any other system that the server reaches out to. Integration, powerful as it is, requires insights into these dependencies so that the plan's risk assessment must include a provision that all these dependencies be pulling in from data silos, may introduce challenges as to how rapidly the design can be implemented, tested, and deployed. So Pete Blaber's observation can be rephrased as, if you aren't confident about how to identify and mitigate risks in an endeavor, you don't understand the situation. The second pillar is building teams. I'm committed to including all stakeholders when a project is started, and that often means many differing viewpoints, and bring the differences to the fore and resolve them. Introduce the team into the cone of uncertainty and get their commitment to limit scope. We're going to talk about the cone of uncertainty in a subsequent slide. And guide the team into those agile, fast processes with quick rounds of implementation and testing. Momentum. As a leader, take responsibility for keeping momentum up. Momentum in a project is a real thing. Loss of momentum, the slowing down of the cycle of implementation, is frequently because of lack of resources for testing. And it requires a hefty amount of effort to restore it, and an effective team leader tries not to let it get to that point. After all the discussion or all the mention of processes and policies and procedures, fundamentally the relationships and trust are more important than process. And when I talk about meetings, this comes to bear. Relationship and trust are based on every mode of communication, but particularly meetings. I would like to come back to building teams. Team building is not a frictionless process. It's a process that acknowledges the needs of all the users, and sometimes these needs directly conflict. The team leader has the opportunity to turn conflict into dialogue, and getting around groupthink or getting around acquiescing to the loudest voice, this helps a project's success. So much so that the fear of conflict in a project is much worse than the existence of conflict. And I'm going to underline this with my subsequent slides. So Damascius was a Greek scholar. Differences really are a natural element of teams. Bringing them to the fore consolidates the team's mutual understanding and strengthens the group, and resolving them lies at the heart of successful projects. Cone of uncertainty. How many people use Agile in their methodology? All right, so you may be familiar with this. The cone of uncertainty is a way of getting to your go live more confidently. The y-axis should actually be labeled unpredictability. If you chunk, you deal with lowering the rate of unpredictability at a slower pace than you would if you used Agile. So the bottom half of this graph is chunking, the green, chunking into short sprints and getting to your go live with much more confidence. Big user experience issues are dealt with at the start. If you're successful at limiting scope and chunking into short sprints, you have the luxury at the end of the project to begin considering interface refinements and interface issues that may not have come up as the project was being designed. And in my experience, this is quite common. Following on from the relationships and trust, meetings are not a waste of time. They are the bedrock of team and trust building, and they can strongly contribute to creating and maintaining momentum. These are my steps that I employ. I do not call a meeting if it does not have a clear purpose. The purpose and the subjects are on the agenda, which is circulated in advance of the meeting to all the stakeholders, and obviously, definitely the meeting attendees. Any action item arising during the meeting is identified and assigned to someone responsible to resolve them with the timeline of when it will be resolved or expected to be resolved. And then within 2 days after the meeting, the minutes are sent out, action items listed, people assigned to listed, and then the final point is when these people do address the action items and they're resolved, they should be acknowledged. That's a lot of meetings, that's a lot of documentation. This also, the documentation of meetings is not a waste of time. Keeping people informed and soliciting feedback ensures the team have a common shared understanding, and it also identifies communication and conflict issues early. Okay, the third pillar is change management. How many of you have to deal with formal change management protocols? All right, so the rest of you are lucky. I will be preaching to the choir for the 3 people that put up their hands. They are required, they are necessary. In North America and Europe, and I think it actually began in Japan, ITIL processes are the standard. ITIL stands for Information Technology Infrastructure Library, which is overwhelmingly unhelpful. And I'm not going to bother reading the entire description. All the notes are in the slide deck in the notes section. Theoretically, a more practical description is, and the one that's functionally used, is ITIL criteria define the maturity of an organization's infrastructure and processes, critical and regulated environments. That's also perhaps not that helpful, but it does underline the fact that what formerly were considered to be required for ITIL, the environments that required it were healthcare and finance, which tended to be the most regulated. We see ITIL now in almost any organization which is answerable to an outside authority, and there are very few organizations, public or private, that do not have some kind of oversight from an outside authority. So here is my definition. ITIL is a system for ensuring deployment and changes to production IT systems are not disruptive. What it actually entails is approvals for changing production systems with documentation of the changes, the list of resources required, the demonstrated successful testing, criteria for ensuring the change was not disruptive, rollback plans with timelines, and reporting after to summarize the results of the changes. Although this does sound onerous, and frankly, to get the entire IT team up to speed and complying, it has huge benefits. So here's an example. The College of American Pathologists, or CAP, accredits all affiliated biorepositories, and the hospital I work for has just such a repository. That FileMaker database does the data entry, the data storage, and the inventory for the biorepository. And to bring it into alignment with CAP, reviewing all of CAP's stipulations, I found that our ITIL practices met all their stringent rules. So ITIL does greatly contribute to compliance with outside bodies. Finally, Agile and ITIL are not mutually exclusive, but you do have to do work to get Agile to conform to the needs of ITIL. It very often involves engaging creatively with the change management process, and rapid implementation of sprints is slowed down, but it is not stopped. It does take documentation, and I have found that the documentation does get easier with time. So why change management? It protects you, it protects the users, and it protects the organization from things that should never happen. So specific skills for enterprise. Buying into change management. Write the standard operating procedures for your solution, because nobody else is going to do it and someone's going to need it, and that someone may indeed be you. I like going in, understanding the differences between differing versions of client and server, not simply with respect to the OSs and hardware, but also the ODBC and the SSL certificate differences between the versions. Other people have different approaches. They really don't care. They know that they can look it up later. I'm not actually one of those people, but there are 2 different viewpoints on this. Server logs. Server logs are your friends. I really consider a skill for enterprise to look at logs from time to time, even or especially if everything is running smoothly, because those baselines will ensure that when you do need them, it's not the first time that you had to think about interpreting them. And if you spend any time on the FileMaker community forum, you'll know that this is actually a key point. Very often people see a problem appearing, and one of the reasons that they end up at the community asking is because it's difficult for them to understand how to use the logs to tell them what to do. some of the first things they're ever told is, what do the logs say? So that's something to bear in mind. Also, I might be an outlier, but I totally I'm committed to levering both external authentication and the very granular native FileMaker security. With 700 users and approximately 80 distinct work groups, it would be very difficult to try and do all of this in external authentication, and also it would place a huge burden on the extremely, up till now, convivial external authentication administrator. So we're moving on to the fourth pillar, security and privacy. These go hand in hand. Despite the occasional news headlines, they are a major consideration in enterprise approach to data collection and storage. The following is the deepest of the deep dive, and it is a description of some common terms, and it's designed to help you understand the broad context. So how many of you are familiar with GDPR? Yeah, okay, so it's something that we all should be sensitive to, even though theoretically for some of us the possibility is remote that it'll come to bear on what we do. I think it's useful to understand what context it is in association with other security and privacy. So FIPA, HIPAA, and GDPR, the acronyms, Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. It's the terminology used in the States, but it's also a very common terminology in other jurisdictions. HIPAA, this is an American term. It has its corollary in virtually every jurisdiction, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. In other jurisdictions, it's simply called Patient Health Information, or PHI. GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, European Union. So FIPA, certainly in Canada and the States, stipulations generally apply to public organizations. There is a very broad commonality. Health information is protected virtually everywhere, and it bears both on security and privacy. The phrase of the GDPR, so a European mandate, applies to data subjects of the EU and EU data controllers. That data subjects is a very careful phrasing. That's the one that's used in the official document. It does not make reference to citizens. It does not make reference to residents, and it does not make reference to passport holders. It simply makes reference to data subjects. GDPR is different from FIPA, and it's different from HIPAA in many different ways. It applies to all modalities of personal data storage and in its jurisdiction, whether it's a public entity or not, and whether it's health information or not. So it overlaps. Okay, I don't want you to read the next slide. I put it in the slide deck for you to refer to. I'm going to highlight some of the aspects that I think are the most important. Again, everything I'm talking about is in the notes. Okay, FIPA. So one of the most important aspects of FIPA is access of information, the right to be forgotten, notification of data breaches, and security of information. Breaches are required to be reported, and the penalties differ a lot. And this is dramatically different from GDPR. Also dramatically different from GDPR, the penalties for breaches can be determined on a case-by-case basis. The federal privacy officer in Canada relies on a complaint-based system. Again, dramatically different from GDPR. One example of why this is dramatically different, GDPR puts the public interest over any attempt at mitigation by the offender. No waivers. And GDPR represents the EU data subjects' rights not only individually but collectively. So if someone was affected by a breach and said, no, it's okay, that's fine, GDPR will basically overrule that and say, we're not representing you, we're representing everybody collectively, and we're proceeding with the penalties for the breach. One of the reasons I'm bringing this up, the fine points of HIPAA have a little bit different from FIPA, is that there are strong provisions for if your patient health information is shared, you must be you have access to disclosure of who that organization shared it with. That's very different from FIPA. Also, the security of the data centers for patient health information are much more stringent than anything in HIPAA and GDPR. One of the aspects of GDPR that really stands out is that auditing can be done. In FIPA and HIPAA, that tends absolutely not to be the norm, but in GDPR, that's actually one of the main planks of it. And that data breach penalties are extremely clearly identified, and the time frame of the data breach event reporting has to happen within 72 hours. And this is different from all other privacy and security provisions. The right to be forgotten, as you can tell, GDPR theoretically, although we won't know until it goes to the courts, has a lot of teeth. And when they say right to be forgotten, which they actually refer to as erasure, is enforced, they can enforce it through an audit. So this is, you could say it's much more onerous, and indeed it is onerous for the data controllers, but in some ways the clarity is actually quite refreshing. I'm going to end this slide with two observations. How does this impact how you design your databases? Well, if your database goes into production and one of the data subjects that has a record in that database contacts the organization and says, I'm enforcing my right to be forgotten, I want all the records, the subject, everything to do with me as a subject deleted from the database, how are you going to approach that? Can you even keep a record that that deletion request was made? And do you have to delete all of that data also from all your backups? So this is a consideration when you're designing that you have to be aware of. The privacy impact on how you deploy. How are you backing up your databases? Can you ensure that strict file and data integrity that complies with FIPA and patient health information and GDPR? We're talking about, do you have sufficient backups and have you validated them? Are you absolutely confident that there is no physical access to the servers within the data center? So we're really getting down to nitty-gritty stuff about it's not good enough to say, oh yeah, the system is secure and we have backups. You may be required to validate those processes. I might be unusual, but it's a strategy that's worked for me in the last 12 years. I have found it helps to develop a cordial relationship with the privacy officer. Because I try and keep communication really brief and on point with them, they actually pick up my phone calls. And it makes everything so much easier. So I have much more confidence in what I do. And I recommend that if you avoid ever finding even out who the privacy officer is in your enterprise, it probably introduces more problems than finding out who that person is. And if they have time, introducing yourself. They actually love talking to database programmers. I'm not sure what it is. However, ultimately, it's your responsibility to know how privacy and security impacts how you work and whether this is enterprise or whether it is not enterprise. Thank you for your patience over the deep dive. Ideas about engaging with confidence. IT team, it is possible to get them on side. Attempt to have a dialogue. Keep all communication on point. Keep current on how the larger trends in information technology may be impacting the enterprise that you're working with. And what I'm thinking about here is the changing landscape, security and privacy. It's changing all the time. Integration opportunities, the opportunities that will present to you also. Things have happened in the last 6 months, simply weren't around a year ago, and it pays to keep current. The FileMaker platform is absolutely perfectly suited to nimble development, so use this to your advantage within the enterprise. Enterprise gives a valuable perspective on the constraints and challenges of larger institutions. It places FileMaker in context as a tool among many, and it sometimes demands an open-mindedness on the part of the developer and a willingness to embrace the organization's imperatives. Working in enterprise is a wonderful opportunity to get rid of your user experience misconceptions. The more you implement and deploy an enterprise, the more enhanced your user experience design talents will be. So keep reading about user experience and keep reading about what you think to be good design and test them within your enterprise experience. I know I keep harping on this, but great communication does come with practice. I wasn't always all that great at writing project plans. Minuting meetings, I now do fairly naturally, and I have learned to grit my teeth and respond proactively when unanticipated events happen. I recommend thinking about communication as a muscle that needs to be exercised, and it really does contribute to performance. So sustainability. Sustainability can be thought of as introducing fragility into your solution. Technical debt. Enterprise solutions have to be as sustainable as possible. And one important reason for this is once they're deployed, there are often much less resources for supporting it than what you might have actually even planned for, but certainly probably hoped for. It needs to be in any developer's mind when choosing strategies and planning a solutions design. So if you have a choice of a number of different ways of approaching resolving an issue, think about the strategy that requires the absolute least technical debt. And this may not seem related, but it absolutely is. Code readability is important not just for you in 6 months' time, but also for the technical support going ahead. I'd like to mention some resources from DevCon from last year. If you didn't catch these, the video is available and the session materials. In the How to Talk to People About Development category, which actually does come to bear on enterprise development to a large degree, Stuart Gritman gave an awesome session, a great description of what to do when things go well, and a wonderful description of what to do when things do not go so well. And his session is entitled Cultivating Project Champions and Coping with Detractors. It was a really frank and refreshing session. And Jordan Watson's The Fine Line Between a Need and a Want, I also found a lot of echoes and a lot of relevant things for enterprise development. Jordan has an amazing repertoire of insights about how to deliver to your users what they can really use. And very relevant to this session from last year's DevCon was Peter Cross's Going Viral with FileMaker ? Not without IT, and great session, and I recommend reviewing it. Christy has a session tomorrow morning in this room. Sustainable apps, how to leverage change management to ensure successful user adoption and high return on investment, Christy Lapidus. Later in the day tomorrow, FileMaker and Agile, how to quickly solve business problems, and this is with Karen Craig at 4 o'clock. And then at 5:30 tomorrow in this room, Susan Fenema and Martha Zink, Operation FileMaker from Risk to Perfection. This is kind of a lovely alignment of stars where, you know, if you want to learn how to be more effective in enterprise, these are all great sessions to be aware of. Related to my talk, but not directly related to project management, are Klaus Levant's talk on GDPR and Mike Bierge's session on security. So that kind of comes to bear on my session, but they're not strictly project related. How many people read the FileMaker community from time to time? Taylor, I know you do. Sorry, who else? So you'll be aware of the first one, I hope. Andy Hibbs launched this thread, GDPR, ostriches with our heads buried in the sand, ? He included documents, he included actionable insights, he included his progress in going through what was quite a painful process in getting his systems ready for GDPR. I know it's a long thread, but I highly recommend it if you really want the resource materials to dig into GDPR. Thank you so much to Andy Hibbs for doing that. It was a huge resource for us. Chris Irvine and Perrin Smith wrote a blog post 2 years ago or more, Idiomatic FileMaker. It was all about scalability. Really excellent. So this is in the slide deck for for the links. Outside FileMaker completely, security and privacy, I could have listed a number of links here. I tried to pick the most authoritative one. So that would be, as far as I'm concerned, Krebs on security. So if you're wondering why this whole email thing of trying to get you to deposit $1,900 in a Bitcoin account is happening, go to Krebs on security, because as soon as that hit, he gave a lengthy and really thorough description. If you want to know what's happening if something is a threat or is not a threat, KrebsOnSecurity.com is probably up to speed on it, and will do the in-depth reporting and fill you in really well. Finally, how many people have read Wim DeCourt and Stephen Blackwell's FileMaker Server 17 white papers? If you want to deploy 17 Server, you can't deploy 17 Server without reading these papers. That might change at 18, but in 17, that's still the case. They are required reading. We're a little bit early by 1.5 minutes, but let's take Q&As, and I'm going to ask for the microphones to be used because we're taping these.
Yes, thank you. Excellent presentation. I have two questions. One was about the data breaches. Mm-hmm. Are they universally defined? And for instance,
could you speak a little bit louder, please?
Are they universally defined? And
are the data breaches universally
yes.
defined? No, absolutely not.
Because one question I have is, does that also include things like losses or file corruption, or something gets misfiled and something? Are those all data breaches?
Yeah, okay. My understanding, and it's not authoritative, and don't take my word for it, but as I understand it, a data breach tends to be any event where the data has become unsecure. So it will include where all of a sudden the network administrator understands that someone has had access.
Right.
Or it can be someone has understood that something was being provided that was never secure. So it can include a range of scenarios, as I understand it.
Yeah, my main question is if you don't really know, what happened. If you're trying to find something, it's not there, and is it because it was never created properly, or was it corrupted, or something else? Not necessarily, obviously the breach is if, there's hacking going on or stuff like that, that's clear. But if it's not clear what happened, does that constitute a data breach?
Do you work with an enterprise?
I'm at Johns Hopkins.
Sorry?
I'm at Johns Hopkins University.
Okay, that's the question to address your privacy officer, because your privacy officer will say, this is how we define it right down the line. And if you say, well, how about this scenario? She may say, I don't consider that to be under the category of breach. So that's why I rely on our privacy officer, because she can tell me up front, that's not a scenario that we have any concerns about. So to be frank, I'm not sure how corruption could be considered to be a breach. It would absolutely fall under the category of a loss of file and data integrity. But that is very different from a breach. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second question is, you mentioned the issue of allowed to be forgotten and the ability to delete information, particularly from backups.
Yeah.
How does that even work? I
mean,
if it's just
I don't know.
If it's just a mirror, yes, but I mean, without destroying the entire backup, I don't know how you would do that.
So the problem with some of these scenarios in deployment is, I was throwing it out there because it's important to think about how this is going to impact so all the privacy officers I've dealt with have been realists. If we ever got a privacy officer in that was not a realist and decided to stick to the letter, these are things that I'm going to have to consider. So definitely right to be forgotten so I have 55 clinical databases. Any one of those, it will be demanded of me that a record or a number of records be deleted. And I have to think about that scenario because in the province of Ontario, not to mention FIPA, we do have a right to be forgotten, and the privacy officer takes it extremely seriously. This is actually one of the reasons why she hates shadow clinical databases recording clinical data, because she knows she can go to the central enterprise system and do it, but then she has to worry about all the FileMaker databases that also may have complementary data. So thinking about how to do that is actually a real issue for me. But when I started thinking about it, if she wasn't so busy, I would ask her to draw a line in the sand and say, please don't tell me this applies to my backups. And if it does apply to my backups, it would change my backup policy. I would basically keep less backups.
And you couldn't actually create backups, you could only create mirrors, because the backups are not in the original FileMaker environment, so you can't go and selectively delete something anymore, because it's in a different format.
Right. So to also put this in perspective, I'm archiving about 30 clinical databases. Because of the PHI, I actually have to keep every database that is no longer being used that has patient data for between 10 and 30 years. So I actually have to begin thinking about putting an archive server in place that can probably be accessed for the next 5 years. And then after that, I will have to keep revisiting and upgrading the OS to make sure that that data is still accessible ad infinitum. It's a nightmare, actually, but, well, it's not a nightmare, it's just something that has to be dealt with.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions?
Hello. First of all, thank you for your presentation. First of all, I just want to ask a question about when you were mentioning at the beginning team interactions and whatnot. Was it specifically about teams of developers and whatnot? Or?
No, it's the project team. When I talk about all stakeholders, I seriously mean all stakeholders. I mean everybody that needs a report from the database, the people who are doing data entry, the person who thinks that they know exactly what the database should do, but if you don't consult all the stakeholders, you find out that the data enterers really have quite different requirements from whatever. So it's only actually speaking to the collective team and all the people involved that you really get a true picture of the solution that you're supposed to be delivering.
Cool. And a second question. Basically, I'm almost literally fresh out of school and was thrust into kind of a somewhat senior position at a big company. Mm-hmm. If you had one word of advice to tell me, what would that be?
Communication. Yeah.
Thank you.
In your company, I mean, you have a lot of databases, and it's very wide enterprise. How with the change management? Obviously, there's project management, change management, and then there's development change management. How do you handle, like with FileMaker, how do you handle the version control?
Okay, so maybe I should have emphasized it more, but ITIL comes to bear on production. I test everything. I do my own stress testing on anything I do. And then I put it up onto a development server. It's not subject to ITIL. I get my users to bash it as much as they have time for on the development server, and then they sign off, and then I begin the request, the official change request to bring the tested changes into production. I might be uncommon, but it's the way I like conducting myself. I don't propose anything for a change unless it's been tested and signed off by the users.
So do you work with the development environment or mostly on the QA side?
I'm a developer.
So how do you guys handle version control? I've got like 5 coders, and sometimes keeping track with FileMaker, it's very difficult for version control. How do you keep track of version control? I mean, I get audited by Sarbanes, I get internal audit, I get Texas Department of Insurance, everybody.
You have 5 FileMaker developers? Mm-hmm. Man, I envy you. A hospital of 15,000 staff, 130 databases, I'm the sole developer.
Okay, so I guess that's easier for you. I don't know, does anybody else have multiple coders?
So doing versioning with a team, it's a whole subject. I don't know. I think what I would recommend, okay, speak to Todd Geist, speak to anybody that has people getting their hands into code. Matt Navarre.
So, no, I missed the beginning of the presentation, so you might have talked about this, but when you're transitioning from your development server to your live server, and you've got lots of changes and people have signed off, what techniques do you use to actually move everything to the live server?
I had a conversation with Tony White about this not so long ago. I wanted to use data migration tool. I didn't know how to test the data migration tool results. I kept a script of things that I had to bear in mind as I was patching. And I had an additional field where I noted all the gotchas that were going to bite me when the users went into their system the next morning. And I have to admit it was long, but I was much more confident because I have no idea how to test the data migration results. I think that this is going to be a lively and interesting discussion because I have detected that there are certain things going on with the data migration tool that had I used it, I would be worrying right now. So before I did this big patch over, I would normally, my canned response would be, if they're little, it's no big deal. If they're big, you have to kind of figure it out ad hoc. But I wish the data migration tool was the answer. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Well, since there is no one answer, then sure, it's good enough. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Oh, session will have updates. Please remember to fill out the session evaluation. And thank you again.